A ver, espera. Don Sergio. Muy bien. Tiene que firmar el
Pero muchas gracias por eso. Yo soy una carrera, pero no me escucha.
¿Qué cosa? Yo sí, no, la línea del... Cuando no. No puedo más de iba caminando. Pero le digo más oye, ¿les va a tomar una foto? Ya, nos va a tomar una foto, ponga cara de...
Con cara de foto.
Ya.
Muchas gracias.
Esto como unas cositas allá.
Sí, Sebastián. No te había ganado. Está tan grande, en realidad. Encontré un centro de estamos parte de la... Y yo también veo. Ya, feliz. Es nomás que toda pintosa como doctora. Yo le recuerdo un colegio.
Es que este año no podía por
No, pero ya está mejor. No, ya está mejor.
no, pero estamos en proceso.
Muy bien, excelente.
Yo estoy pidiendo las cartas de recomendación.
¿Ya a quién le pidió?
No, tengo el mail.
¿De quién le va a pedir?
A la profe. Pero sí quiero, porque tenía mis planes para este agosto. Eso va a ser cuando se abre. Habrá que hacer un esfuerzo.
No, pero aprovecha hacer el de acá.
No, sí,
de educación. Tengo que promover el de nuestro departamento.
No, sí, acá, profe, porque no puedo viajar, no puedo.
No, y aparte que está pensado para profesores de ejercicio, se hacen las clases los sábados, y te las vas a tener bien.
O sea que no voy a tener
Entonces tenía que ir durante 2 años y dar las vacaciones de verano y de invierno. Y el resto fue trabajo.
Hello. Okay, we're going to start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this activity called Let's Talk About Research, organized by the Department of Languages, Literature, and Communication, Universidad de La Frontera, with the support of the Faculty of Education, Social Sciences, and Humanities. This is the third of 4 talks about research methodologies in different areas. The general purpose of doing this cycle of talks is to give both students and university teachers, as well as teachers in the school system, the opportunity to enlarge their knowledge about different academic and scientific topics. And very important, to provide an instance in which you can hear the English language. We want to thank all the students and teachers who are participating with us in person, as well as the students and teachers who are connected through the online connection. First, we will have a presentation by a PhD in psychology, and then we will have some time for questions and comments. So if you're participating online, we invite you to write your questions on the chat. On this occasion, we are pleased to introduce the PhD in psychology, Ligia Orellana, who earned her degree from the University of Sheffield, UK. She's a researcher and academic at University of La Frontera and works at the psychology department and the technological scientific nucleus in social sciences and humanities of this university. She has a background in social psychology, and her teaching and research interests focus on gender and sexuality, LGBTQ plus issues, and subjective well-being. Ligia's going to talk about how fictional stories can help reduce transphobia. So let's receive her with a round of applause.
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak and for the opportunity to tell you about one of the studies I conducted for my PhD. First of all, I want to apologize because the poster said that I was going to talk about 2 experiments, but due to time constraints, I would rather just focus on one, so I can tell you about it in detail. So also the poster says that I uses the term of transphobia. I usually choose to use the terms that people are most familiar with, but in the literature, we talk mostly about transnegative. So, well, I will tell you what this wall here means as we progress throughout the talk. So I will tell you a little bit about how fiction can serve as what we call mediated contact to help reduce prejudice towards transgender people, and most specifically towards transgender. So the program for this talk is very straightforward, like it follows the usual chapters of the study, from introduction, method, results, and discussion. And all the images you see are from series or films that not only focus on transgender characters, but also have transgender actors who are portraying these characters. So for a bit of a background on where my study comes from, first of all, I would like to ask you 2 questions. Well, you don't have to answer me, but the first question is, what is your gender? And this is a question that we encounter very often. You may say you're a man, you're a woman, or you are of other gender, with a non-binary, by gender, gender fluid. The categories are ever increasing because people are finding the language to talk about who they are. But the second question here is, does your gender match the sex you were assigned at birth? And here you could say yes, you could say no, or you could say I prefer not to answer. If you say yes, you are a gender person. If you say no, you are a transgender or non-binary person. And if you prefer not to answer, that's completely okay, because these questions are actually very sensitive. You have to be very careful when you approach these subjects in a manner that is respectful for everyone. So for the purposes of this study, we have the cisgender group as what we call the normative group, or the in group. And I will tell you about what that means in a little bit. And the cisgender and mostly transgender women, mostly, what we call the out group. And I will tell you what that means in the following slides. But let's start talking about the media portrayals of transgender people. This is because most of us didn't grow up with an idea of what transgender means, not even transgender people, because most of our knowledge of this topic comes from what the media tells us. And usually what the media has told us is that transgender people are something very rare. They're usually others. This is what I mean when we talk about out group, a group that is not my own. They are others to be pitied, others, ridiculed. Usually I use this recommendation of a documentary that's called Disclosure that tells us how transgender media portrayals have been evolving since the story of film. But usually this kind of narrative shows us also the idea that transgender women are just a man in a dress. And this also extends to casting cisgender actors to play transgender characters in movies or in films. Transgender people are also shown as a source of target of harm or evil. There's a lot of their suffering can be treated as a fetish, like trans people they always suffer, or they always have a hard time in their life. They're deceivers, they're people who are lying to you, who try to trick you into believing they are something they are not. They're predators, they're killers, they're victims, people who suffer a lot. Or the way they are portrayed, the storyline focuses on their transitional story, or on how they're suffering oppression or suffering in the end. So this is the idea that we grow up with. And this has a lot of implications for how we treat transgender people in real life. So a lot of these ways of thinking about transgender people connect with what we call trans negativity, or that's prejudice towards trans people. And because of these ideas that we have of the trans people as something bad, not even people sometimes, trans people face a lot of stigma, harassment, and exclusion from all dimensions of social life. They also experience higher rates of poverty because they cannot access employment opportunities, not even education opportunities. They have scarce legal protections, inadequate healthcare access and services, and of course, a very high risk of becoming targets of hate crimes and violence. So the basis for this kind of treatment can be found in what we call prejudice from social psychology. Prejudice comes from this idea that there's what I told you, that it's an in-group, what we call us and them. So this is like the basic way of thinking of us human beings. Like there's people who are like me and there's people who are unlike me. The problem here is that prejudice, I could give you a very conceptual definition of what prejudice is from social psychology, but the problem is that people are defining prejudice depending on their group. The meaning of prejudice is changing constantly. So, for instance, someone might tell you, I am not homophobic, but I think a man and a woman getting married is the only natural thing. So people always find a way to distance themselves to say, no, that is not prejudice. That's just nature. That's not prejudice. That's just the way things are. So it's very difficult to find or to try to capture prejudice, and obviously then to try to do something about it from social psychology. But to try to tackle this problem, there was this idea that is called contact theory. This was proposed by Gordon Alport in 1954. It was called then the contact hypothesis because it was tested. It was being tested at the time. But what contact theory tells us is that if you have two groups that are in conflict and you bring them together, you can improve the relationships between these two groups. At the time, what Alport found was that you needed 4 essential conditions to make sure that one group and another one got along and there was no prejudice between them. And that was that the group had to have similar status, a common goal, cooperation between members of the groups, and institutional support. As time has progressed, contact theory has been proven. Like it stands the test of hypotheses and it has stand the test of time. But at the moment, we think that there are at least 13 conditions that would allow us to achieve this idea of reduction of prejudice between two groups. And that is very difficult to do. Overall, what we do know is that contact is an effective intervention to reduce prejudice, as long as we take certain measures to conduct this kind of intervention. What we do know is how intergroup contact, like contact between these two groups, can have an effect on reduced prejudice. And what the findings tell us at the moment is that there are 3 mechanisms that are the most relevant. The first one is the cognitive mechanism, what we call knowledge about the other. A lot of people say that prejudice comes from ignorance, from not knowing about the others, and that's somewhat true. But there are 2 more powerful mechanisms which come from the affective route. And these mechanisms are intergroup anxiety and empathy and perspective taking. Intergroup anxiety happens when you, let's say you are a cisgender person who has never met a trans person, and you know you're going to meet one of them. You start thinking about how you're going to behave, what you're going to say. Are you going to be frightened? Are you nervous? Are you anxious about saying the wrong thing? So this is a little bit of what intergroup anxiety causes. And of course, taking the perspective of other people who are not you, who are unlike you, can very much help to reduce prejudice. So what we know is the affect, these 2 routes, are the most effective mediators between contact and prejudice. Not necessarily knowledge about the group, not necessarily knowing in a way that you would read like on Wikipedia or scientific studies, but mostly it's how you feel about it. And this leads us to talk about indirect contact. Because I, as a researcher, cannot bring a transgender person in front of a cisgender person that they have never met, because that would be unethical. I wouldn't know if I'm putting the transgender person in danger, or at least at risk of a very uncomfortable moment. So what happens here is that some interactions simply cannot be promoted. It cannot be ethical to bring together two groups who are in strong conflict with one another. So there are different types of contacts that we could find in the literature, but we don't know if they are useful for contact with sexual and gender minorities. Like, the evidence here is very mixed. Like, it might work sometimes, it doesn't work sometimes. So there's really not a consistent pattern of findings here. But we do know that there are positive findings when we talk about positive media representation of sexual and gender minorities. Overall, we do know that this thing that we call indirect contact is not a substitute of proper contact, but it's a preparation for direct contact. And all this reading led me to find fiction. And people might wonder, like, why fiction? Fiction is a lie. Fiction is not true. Fiction, effectively, when you see the definition of it, is an account of a series of events that are partially or entirely made up. They are developed as a narrative to induce the perspective of a hypothetical factual observer. That's very straightforward. But when psychology started going into the realm of imagination, of fiction, what psychologists found in this field is that fiction is a simulation of selves. Fiction is a simulation of social worlds. Fiction strives for realism. You can have a fictional story with fantasy and dragons and fairies, but it is real when it talks about aspects of the human experience. And I'll tell you what I mean about it. Why fiction can work as contact or as indirect contact. First of all, fiction doesn't have to be true. It has to be believable. And a lot of good fiction does the job. So fiction, first of all, portrays the most fundamental aspect of the human experience, the social and psychological life. If you know Animal Farm from George Orwell, the characters are animals that live in a farm, like pigs and horses, but they do talk about a very specific aspect of social life that relates to authoritarianism and dictatorship. And that's why it's a very powerful book. Fiction also works because it's not only for entertainment, but it's also for meaning. It is very important that we find others who are like us in fiction. We find characters with whom we identify, that speak to who we are, or we try to understand ourselves via these characters. There's also how fiction really works. I'm going to go into detail, but this is, I think it's for me, the most interesting part of my research, of my PhD in terms of theory. But fiction, for instance, works because you don't tell people what's happening, you show them. And when you show people what's happening, they engage and they get lost in the story. Good fiction does that. It doesn't have to tell you that a person is running, but it has to tell you how this person feels, all their muscles and how they feel, why they're running, what they're thinking about, and that's when you engage. There's also evidence from neuropsychology that there's a field that studies the effect of fiction on social cognition that's called neurocognitive poetics, which shows, for instance, that what we call the default mode network engages in a lot of our social interactions, but it engages in the same way when we read fiction. Or there are parts of our brain that light up, like if I'm holding this object, it will also light up when I'm reading a story about holding this object. But most importantly, fiction works because of two key elements. First, the characters. You need to have good characters, and it's not necessarily that you have a list of traits that how a character is. What matters in fiction is what a character wants and all the conflict that characters go through to get what they want. And this also brings us to talk about the emotions that come along that journey that the characters go on. So we have found a lot of evidence, so there's a lot of evidence by now of the effects between fiction and social cognition. First, because as I told you, we use it to identify with others. And adherence to group membership just happens naturally. It's not thinking that we do, it's not something that we do deliberately. And group membership is also a guiding social environment. What group do I belong to? And thus, how am I supposed to behave? What am I supposed to do? We will also find that the fictional narratives tend to have a very positive effects on intergroup attitudes, empathy, what we call theory of mind, or the ability to read, kind of read other people's thinking. Fictional narratives can also improve attitudes towards immigrants, gay people, and refugees. It also has an important effect in gender stereotypes in children. When children are exposed to certain stereotypes, this also has an effect on their social cognition on long term. And even it improves attitudes towards animal welfare or animal protection. And the key aspect, or why fiction has this effect, has been termed transportation. In psychology, or in this field of psychology, we understand transportation as the emotional and cognitive immersion in the story, what we call getting lost in the story. When you're watching or when you're binging a next Netflix series because you get lost in it, you get so immersed that you want to keep going, that's transportation. And this is the element that appears to influence individuals' attitude when they engage in fiction. We know by now that transportation is a mediator between fiction and prejudice reduction because it helps increasing empathy. It increases the likelihood of prosocial behavior, which is more of an impact in the material world, and even with persuasion in certain attitudes. And these effects, this is crucial, have been observed regardless of the medium in which the story is presented. The person may be reading a story or they may be watching a story, but the effects tend to be the same. So as I was reading all this for my PhD and for the studies I wanted to conduct, I realized that there was a unifying thread between my area of social psychology and fictional stories, and that was emotion. Both fiction and contact theory had emotion at the heart of their inner works, of their mechanisms. Once on one side for transportation and on the other side for intergroup anxiety. And for both, we had enough evidence to say that this emotion could be a mediator between exposure to a character, to a person from the outgroup, and prejudice. But for that to happen, it was also important that there was a complex representation of individuals, and we were talking about contact theory, and we're talking about real people, or characters when we're talking about fiction. So this led me to this one study from my PhD, and the background here comes from a very urgent matter that was also happening as I was doing my PhD. And it was the increasing violence towards transgender women. And it was a few years ago when we were seeing a climate that remains to this day. And portrayals of transgender women have been found to be linked to higher transmisogyny, to the prejudice that's linked between not only because the person is transgender, but also because it's a woman. A higher risk of encountering fatal violence and what we are called trans panic. This comes from what we used to call gay panic. And the trans panic has been used as a legal defense, even when a cisgender man kills a transgender woman. Sometimes the legal defense is, I panicked. I just didn't know this person was transgender. I panicked and I killed them. And that has been used as a legal defense. That it's used less and less now, and less accepted, but it has been accepted as But we have research that also says that positive media representations of transgender women can help us to shift towards more trans positive attitudes. So the aim of my study was to test whether the exposure to trans-related fiction would be associated with lower trans negativity when we compared it to a control story when cisgender participants. And we tested the mediating role of both transportation and intergroup anxiety in this relationship. How does this look like, the hypothesis? Well, on one side, you have the type of story I'm using. Because I'm running an experiment, I need a control group, and I need a group with a condition. Here's transportation, intergroup anxiety, trans negativity. And my first hypothesis was, of course, that reading fiction would be linked to lower trans negativity compared to a fiction that had no mention of transgender people whatsoever. The second hypothesis talked about the mediating role of transportation between reading fiction and transnegativity. I hope that people who read fiction would report more transportation compared to those who read control story. And this in turn will be linked to lower transnegativity. And a third hypothesis talked about the sequence of effects in which reading fiction would be linked to higher transportation. Higher transportation would be linked to lower intergroup anxiety, and intergroup anxiety would be linked to lower transnegativity. So this is testing a mechanism that tries to find a common ground between social psychology and literature. So how did I come about testing this? I had 84 cisgender adults. This was in Sheffield, the United Kingdom. I hope most of the sample was adults. Some of them were from the university, some were staff or students. But I tried to increase the representation of the general population. The ages were also very wide, like the age range was very wide, from 18 to 84 years. Most participants were white and straight. Most had an undergraduate or postgraduate education level, and most reported not knowing a transgender person. And we're going to see that this is a very important detail that we need to take into account. So over about 68% of the sample had never known a transgender person personally. Well, like I told you, this is an experiment, like a very straightforward experiment in which there was a random allocation to one of three conditions. The first condition was that the person would watch 2 episodes of the web series Her Story, which features transgender characters, and it is written by transgender women. Or they could be allocated to the second condition, which was reading 2 short stories also about transgender women and written by a transgender author. Or they could be allocated to the control story, which was a science article about Mars exploration, which has nothing to do, obviously, with the topic at hand. So we could make the comparison between these 2 topics. Well, for the measures, I asked about socio-demographic questions. I used the transportation scale. I'll tell you what stimulus assessment means in a bit. I used the genderism and transnegativity scale, but only the transnegativity to the scale. The intergroup anxiety scale, where I asked people how would they feel if they encounter a transgender person. And it has 6 items related to positive and negative emotions. And I asked them also if they knew someone who was transgender. The study received ethical approval from the psychology department at the University of Sheffield. It took me a while to recruit the participants because I required them to come to the lab. So there was a big window of recruitment. Obviously, in the meantime, I did other studies too. I wasn't just waiting for people to come here, but it took a while. So then participants would come into the lab, they would sit at a computer, and I would just run the program. I didn't know which condition they were being allocated to, neither did they. And the participants received £5 on course credit if they were psychology undergrads. And I tested this hypothesis using the ESPSS microprocessor, which allows me to test this sequential mediation model that I just showed you. So what did we find here? So stimulus assessment refers to testing whether the stories were equivalent, because I wanted to make sure that people found the stories equally interesting and equally artistic, because if they were equal, I would know that the difference, if there was any difference, would be due to the presence of characters, not because the story was, or because one story was more interesting than the other. And yeah, indeed, there were not significant differences between the 2 conditions, so that was good. The first hypothesis was partially supported, mostly because at first I was testing these 2 conditions against the third one. If you recall, this is the web series transfiction, short story transfiction, and science article control. There was no difference when I grouped these 2 and compared them to the science article. But I ran a further test, and there was an important difference here when I just tested the written stories. So this would be an argument for future studies to just focus on one type of media. In this case, I wanted to choose, or I wanted to test whether there would be difference between media, not only between topics. But in this case, the differences were only found in the stories that were in print. And well, for the second and third hypotheses were supported. So what we know about this is that if you read trans fiction, you will indeed experience more transportation. If you experience more transportation, you will experience lower intergroup anxiety. So we can have hope with getting immersed in a story will make you feel more at ease with the characters. And people who went this route reported lower trans negativity. So the third hypothesis, which tested the whole model, was. But there was one more element that I told you about that I wanted to see, having previous contact with a trans person changed this effect, and they did. Because participants who did not know someone who was transgender tended to show lower trans negativity. But participants who knew someone who had a transgender acquaintances showed no significant differences. What did this tells us? This is in line with previous studies that said that this kind of contact, like indirect contact or contact via fiction, is more effective, or it can be more useful for people who do not know someone personally from the other group. So it is indeed a way that we can start introducing the idea of other people, of an outgroup, for people who generally wouldn't have this type of contact in real life or in their everyday life. So from these results, well, the study is published, in case you would like to see the details more about all the analysis that we ran. But the main findings tells us that media exposure to transgender characters can reduce trans negativity, and this is done via emotion, not necessarily knowledge, not necessarily presenting a paper or a Wikipedia entry about transgender people, but showing how they experience their life, their everyday life. And these emotional responses are linked both to fiction, to literature, and to intergroup dynamics, or to social psychology. And well, there's a discussion to be had about the value of what we call here flat characters, because the written fiction was not what we would call literary fiction, like more sophisticated type of fiction. But that didn't matter here, and that's great, because it also tells us that stories can be accessible to a lot of people. The problem sometimes with the studies with fiction is that they can be a little elitist. Like they rely on people who read a lot, or who read contemporary literature or classic literature. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be accessible for everyone. So we know that transportation is a significant mediator, and overall, what happened here is that the more transported cisgender participants were into the story with transgender characters, the lower intergroup anxiety they reported about encountering transgender people. So at the start of this talk, I showed this wall. It's an art installation called the castle, and it's meant to convey the power of a book, or the power of a story, because you can see that this is a wall with a little crease here. And this is also a bit of a metaphor that I use a lot in my PhD, because sometimes when you're doing postgraduate studies, you think that you're not doing anything, or you dream of doing this big study that will change everything, and it will not be the case, but you will make a difference. Something will be off after you study, after you run a study, after you conduct a study. And in this case, it could be a book, a story, the findings that you have. So to me, it was very important to always keep going, and to remember that it makes a difference whether we see transgender people on the screen, or whether we continue studying these topics. Of course, my study has some limitations. You notice that the sample was very small. It was non-probabilistic. It was self-selected. Obviously, it's very difficult to have people come to university and sit at a computer and read. So there was a lot of difficulties with that. Also, there might be some confounds to the responses that people provided related to social desirability, to certain manipulations of the characters in the type of story. Also, the sample had socio-demographic characteristics associated already with lower transnegativity. For instance, that they all had university studies, which has been found that is linked to lower prejudice. Participants who volunteered were already interested in engaging with fiction because the study had called for people who like to read or see stories. So obviously that was a part of the selected sample. And on this basis, this type of studies should be conducted in other populations who have a higher baseline prejudice, or even populations from sexual minorities. We're talking about how sexual minorities engage with people with transgender and non-binary people. So this study, this field of studies also have very important implications. We also see that there's a lot of progress, maybe not enough in the big scheme of things, but there's a lot of important progress in how we see portrayals of transgender people on screen. We might find a few examples here and there of trans actors who are portraying characters in which their gender identity is not relevant. And that is good because it's just actors doing their job. So what we learn from this is that short engagement with fiction can help improve intergroup attitude, but we need emotional engagement. And for having emotional engagement with this, the story has to be well written, it has to be good, it has to be complex. Because media representation is not just about the presence of an outgroup character, but also allowing this character to be complex, like people are. A character cannot just be fully good or fully bad. There has to be complexities. You can think of villains that you like, that you identify with, because you can see these complexities. That's a good character. For cisgender people, seeing accurate media representations of transgender people can help them, can provide them with a deeper understanding of life experiences to counter misconceptions and stereotypes about how transgender people live life and who they are. And for transgender people, it's also very powerful to see their group and their experiences positively portrayed in the media. And this also sends the message that transgender people belong in the world as much as everyone else belongs. So the takeaway message of my study, as I like to present, is that exposure to fiction featuring transgender women was associated with lower transnegativity via two mechanisms. A proximal factor to fiction, which was transportation, the story was immersive enough, and a proximal factor to contact, which was intergroup anxiety. The representation of the outgroup characters, and these were the characters of one of the stories I presented, reduced the audience's perceived threat from the out. Overall, fiction works here because it shows us novel worlds and vantage points, and it can help us as audiences to recognize people that are unlike us and to understand that they belong to the wider social world. So well, this has been my study, and thank you very much for your attention.
Very much, Ligia, for your excellent presentation. Okay. Now we will have some time for questions, so we invite you to raise your hand and participate. If you're participating online, please write your questions in the chat so that we can read them here. The idea is to have this interaction in English, but don't worry if your English is not perfect or fluent. What's important in this moment is communication. Any questions? I have a question. Yes, I would like to know if you would like to copy this study here with Chilean population, or if you have done that before, or if there are similar studies with like conducted with this population.
Yes, when I returned from my PhD, I wanted to follow this line of study, but the context was very different. So also the importance when you're choosing a study is also that you personally enjoy, but also that kind of responds to what is happening. And I found it difficult to try to talk about fiction in this region, like to ask people to read stories at the time. I think now I feel more prepared to go back to this line of research. It's the one that I really like the most. I know there are studies that are being conducted here in this line. In Latin America, I think there are a few students here. I don't know if they're here, but they are also in psychology, that they are studying media representation of trans people. So this is a topic that I think is reaching now the Chilean context, the Latin American context. And it really depends on who you're focusing on, whether if it's used for reduction of prejudice and you work with cisgender people, or if it's how media representations work for transgender. So it can go those two ways. I think I hope that in the next few years that we will see more studies here in this language.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ligia. It was very interesting because this is a topic that is new for us. Yeah, and your explanation, the way that you explained that was very, very interesting. Yeah, I would like to ask you if you have the data or not. Yes, in terms of Chile. Yeah, what's the percentage of the population considered transgender?
We have very little data on that. I know there are some numbers from the INJU, but because the study or the interest of gathering statistics is mostly focused on younger people, because I think there's a lot of this idea that sexual orientation and gender identity is only a thing of younger people, but also because it's very difficult that older people identify themselves, whether because they live in a hostile environment or they're not fully comfortable disclosing that information. I know there are overall the international statistics or statistics at an international level say that transgender people make up about 1% of the world population, which is still very big. And I think that also might be underestimating the number of people, precisely because a lot of people are not ready or are not able to identify themselves. So usually in younger populations, it's even about 3-5%. In the studies I'm running, which are with I'm currently running studies on well-being in university students, and there's like 9% of my university sample are transgender and non-binary. So I think that's a big number, and that's great. It goes between 4 and 9% depending on the sample, but out of 900 students, I think that's a very important one.
I wanted to ask if you have you considered with video games. Like I am very influenced by video games, but I understand that there is a big community of trans people and non-binary people in the online community, and this includes video games, especially there are awesome reference like Celeste that portrays trans people, but I don't know if you have you considered it in an academic study, because I know that video games are perceived like a low thing.
Yes,
in academic studies.
yes. I personally haven't gone into video games, but one of my colleagues in the same program at the same time was working with video games and virtual reality and fiction. He wasn't looking at gender identity, but he came across those studies, and I think it will be very important there. I remember at some point I considered using a game in which it was about a trans girl going into thermal springs, and all it takes to navigate just going to a pool as a transgender person. So I think there's a big potential to explore this idea of empathy and perspective taking. If you put cisgender people in the shoes, literally, of transgender people going about what very mundane activities, like just going to the bathroom or going to a pool, it's things that a lot of us take for granted. It would be a very great space to explore it in video games. So I haven't personally done it, but I know that there's an interest in that. I haven't seen it in Chile, so it would be very interesting to see.
Maybe going in another line, but maybe there is a study about it, but in the line of like turning the tables, because you said about the like series, movies, and like books, that the writer is a transgender, and the characters are also transgender. But in the matter, like for example, the Danish girl that is not a trans person, but is making the character of a transgender. So it's like going to the other way around, because it's not trans doing a trans like thing. So I don't know if it's maybe related, or if you can like maybe.
Yeah, it is very related, and it's a discussion that you have to consider if you're going into this field, particularly with the Danish girl. There was a lot of criticism because the cisgender actor playing the transgender woman, he was very exaggerating how he thinks femininity should be. So what actually, if you see, I think disclosure addresses that same idea. Overall, what transgender actors will tell, I mean, everybody can play, a good actor can play a lot of roles. But the thing is that transgender actors have not been extended the same courtesy as cisgender actors have been extended. So the problem here with trans actors is also the meta-narrative that exists, actors playing trans characters, is the meta-narrative that people see that the actor is playing a woman in a dress. So people tend to bring this meta-narrative to saying, oh, it's just in a costume, like a lot of trans people are. So it's a bit of a trap there, because it's not just the story, but it's the story outside the story. And so, well, at the end, I was showing you two trans actors who were playing just characters where gender identity didn't come into play, and that's what they asked for. Just the same opportunities to be able to play different roles and not necessarily centering on their life as trans.
And like going back to the question she asked about the number of trans persons here, like obviously not the exact number, but what is like the percentage of trans persons in UK?
In the UK, it's been changing, but it's always less than 10% of the population, and it depends a lot on the ages, on the cohorts. So you will find more trans people in the younger populations, but I think it's about our international levels. It's always between 1 and 9, if you want to be generous, but it's always, you could say it's a small percentage, but it's also an important percentage.
One last question. We all know about gay people, yes, in the story, yes, in the Middle Ages, in Rome, in Greece, yes, but not about transgender people. Do you know that, of course, you say that this is or young people are the ones who say about talk about it. Yes. But what about the history of this trans negativity, or I mean, is there a specific moment in the story, in the history of the world, in which they started to talk about this term?
Transgender people have existed throughout the story, but the term transgender came up in 1995, and we have to remember that all this language of gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans is very recent. And in terms of identity, the construction of identity is also very recent. So we will find what we call now transgender people in other cultures, in ancient Rome too. We will find there's some priestesses or a goddess in Greece who are not transgender women, because we cannot describe that term, but they would resemble what we know or what we think as transgender women. We will also find outside of Western societies, resident in particularly the First Nations, or in Asia or in Africa, we're going to find different societies that have more than two genders. And what I really like about this is that usually when you look at the social roles of people outside, male and female, they are carers. They are people who take care of each other. They have labor. They have caring labor. They are priestesses, or they are priests. They have a spiritual role. They have very important roles that go beyond reproduction, which is very important, because usually people say, well, it should be men and women because reproduction is important. But it's also important that your offspring survive, that they learn the culture, that they are well in their spirituality. So we will find this, the notion of male and female is very recent, and it's very Western too. So I was reading just yesterday about I don't recall the name, but there's a tribe, I think in Africa or in Asia, that has 5 genders, and it's man, woman, and there's another 3 genders, and one of them is usually an intersex person who is also a priestess. They have this spiritual role. So the story of transgender people throughout history is also very fascinating, but also it doesn't fit our language at the moment, or our idea that it's just someone who goes from one gender to the other, because usually that's our understanding right now. But the existence of people who go beyond these strict roles of gender have existed since the beginning of humanity.
I've been told several times about the differences from transsexual and transgender. But it's not clear for me, because when you think of gender, you think of your maybe something that is in your mind. But if you think of transsexual, you think of something that is more biological. But how do they compare, or what differences are there?
Yes, well, the term transsexual came first, and again, it was the language that they had at the time. I think, for instance, between the First and the Second World War, and there was this, what's called like an emergence of sexual citizenship, in the sense that a lot of people were more able to explore their gender and their sexual orientation between the world wars. So transsexual has some longer history. Transgender, in a way, emerged to try to counter the idea that it was just a physical change, that it was that it had to be more like a very integral change of the person without changing who they are. Right? You will find also that there are different cultures that in which you can use these 2 terms. You will, even in Argentina, there's a distinction. When we sometimes say LGBT, they say LGBTT, because they recognize transgender, transsexual, and transvestite people. But this is because there's also a very political story behind that. There's a political recognition in certain identities, but some people took it as an insult because it was meant to be an insult, but people reclaimed it as their own. And there was something powerful in reclaiming that term, so it sticks to this day. So always, I think the best way to know is to ask the person how they're most comfortable with the label. Some people will use transsexual because they feel comfortable with it. Others will not. Others will say it's not that, it's transgender. Others prefer to stay with trans overall. So there's a lot of conceptual differences, and when you see the story, the politics of it, it's very complex. But overall, it just comes down to how the person feels the most comfortable with the label. We don't give, as for instance, from social psychology, we don't make the labels, but people make the labels to express themselves. So this is why we see a lot of labels coming up, because they don't come from academia, they come from people who are trying to find a language. So yeah, yes, it's a question that arises a lot, like transgender, transsexual. Usually it's transgender or just trans, but you will find that some people use transsexuals. Do I answer your question?
I keep on having the same question because, okay, how could I differentiate? It's not possible if you don't belong to those groups. Because it's not just saying, okay, I'm transsexual, I'm transgender, but how do you know?
Do you have to know? Because sometimes
No, but as you you have been labeling, or people have been labeling them. So do I need to know? So why labeling them if I don't want to know? You see?
Why do you call yourself Chilean?
Because I am from Chile.
Yes. That's important to you. Like if I say you're from Argentina, or if I say your nationality comes from another place, you will correct me. You will say you're from Chile. So it really comes from a very deep sense of self in that way. But if you're asking me in terms of concepts of transsexuality and transgender, transsexuality indeed arose in a manner to try to explain physical changes. But a lot of trans people were not comfortable with being defined in terms of their body. So the idea of transgender comes from the idea of the adoption of the roles, also of adopting the roles that relate more to gender, that's more like a social construct, versus something that it's more, sex is also a social construct, but people, for the sake of it, let's say the sex is a biology thing. So trans people do not want to be defined by their biology, but by who they are and who they are in society and their roles. So that's kind of like the difference at a very conceptual level. Yeah.
Once again, we would like to thank Ligia for her book, which connects us a bit more with the globalization and knowledge of different academic and scientific topics. Before you go, and because your opinion about this activity is important to us, we want to ask you to help us improve the organization of the future talks. So please, answer all the 4 questions. We are sharing the link to it on the chat, and also you can scan this QR. Oh.
Mediante la ley internet.
As we mentioned at the beginning, this is the third of 4 presentations that the department will carry out. So we want to invite you to participate in the following one, which will be held